One of the more disappointing seasons that we saw from an individual player last year, at least relative to his expectations from the prior year anyway, was from Nikola Vucevic. Now I say relative because it's important to note that Vuce is a player and the skill set that he provides, as well as his numbers, putting up 17.6 points per game, 11 rebounds, 3.2 assists, and a block and a steal per game. Like, by most NBA standards, that's a very productive season, but most NBA players, you don't trade 2 first-round picks and a young former lottery pick player for. It's safe to say that Vucevic did not have an all-star level season like he had in the year the Bulls traded for him. So because of all of this, it calls into question, what does the future look like for Nikola Vucevic on the Chicago Bulls, given he's going into the last year of his contract, he's extension eligible this summer, and because it's been reported that there is mutual interest between Vucevic and the Bulls to have him remain on the team and discuss a contract extension as training camp hits. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about what a contract extension for Vucevic might look like and whether it actually makes sense for the Bulls to extend Vucevic beyond next season. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. If you're new to the channel and you like the content, be sure to subscribe, as it would mean a great deal to me, as it helps keep the channel going. And in return, I'll keep putting out Bulls content all season long. But let's talk about today's topic. So as I'm sure some of you saw, as was reported by Joe Cowley of the Chicago Sun-Times, that the Bulls will be having initial discussions with Vucevic regarding a contract extension during training camp. Now, I should start by saying that I'm not a big fan of Joe Cowley's work. I think he's one of these writers that prefers to see the demise of the Bulls over their success and will say outlandish things just to get Bulls fans riled up. And I don't really view him as the most credible source compared to others on the Bulls beat. But nevertheless, it's not like this is a report that is that far-fetched by any means. It's not a surprise that the Bulls will have quote-unquote initial discussions with Vucevic because he is extension eligible. It would be weird if discussions around his contract did not happen, and as I mentioned before, the Bulls traded a lot to get this guy, mortgaging a good amount of their future for him. It's not like they're wanting to give all of that up to only have him play for 2 seasons and a half, unless of course they traded him to get some value in return, which I'll talk about. But in short, the report coming from Joe Cowley really shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But here's the thing. All things being equal, based on what we know of Vucevic now and the season that he just had, should the Bulls even offer him an extension? And what would a contract extension look like? Now, a couple things to point out. As I mentioned, Vucevic is in the final year of his 4-year, $100 million contract that he signed back with the Magic. The final year will be worth $22 million. By the time the 2022-23 season rolls around, when this presumed next contract would kick in, Vucevic will be 33 years old. Or will have just turned 33 anyway, which isn't old by NBA standards per se, but it's not young either, especially if it's going to be a longer term extension. Like, giving Vucevic a 3-year deal would put him at near 36 years old by the time that contract expires, and for a guy who kind of looked like he might be on the decline based on what we saw last year, that could be a concern when you're extending a guy now all the way through the 24-25 season. But all this depends on the dollar amount. And if you can get Vuce on a cheap 3-year contract, then the risk of him falling off in that final year is less of a concern, especially with the salary cap continuing to go up. Or if you're the Bulls, do you do a shorter term deal to align with DeRozan's contract to keep the continuity of that core and gives you the flexibility to open up cap space with your older players as their contracts expire at the same time? Or do you not extend him this offseason, see how things go, see how he performs this upcoming year, and assess what kind of contract extension, if any, you offer him to have a better idea of what his value is going to be by the time this new contract actually kicks in? The risk you run with that, though, is he'll be an unrestricted free agent next offseason if you do not extend him, and you could potentially lose him for nothing if some other team offers him an insane contract that the Bulls just can't match because of their salary cap. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, for Vucevic's side, he likely knows that based on how he performed last year, that his value isn't as high as he would like it to be. Like, the Bulls aren't going to be willing to offer him a fat extension after a subpar season that he just had. If he does receive an extension offer, it's going to be more closely representative of the value based on his performance from this past season rather than the all-star Vuce that we saw before. So if you're Vucevic, it might make more sense to bet on yourself, now having a little more structure and familiarity with your role in this new roster and system, and thrive have a bounce back season and get a bigger contract than he otherwise would in signing an extension this offseason. Obviously, the downside is you underperform even further, or say you have a major injury, knock on wood that none of that happens, of course. But for Vucevic, you run the risk of something like that happening to now you're likely getting even less than you otherwise would have if you had just agreed to an extension this offseason. I kind of liken this similarly to Lauri Markkanen's rookie contract extension, where Markkanen had a fairly underwhelming third season after turning heads in his rookie and sophomore years, and his value dropped a bit when it came to that extension after what we saw him do in his third year. And ultimately, the Bulls and Markkanen weren't able to agree on a contract because the Bulls, although wanted to keep him around and offered him an extension, Markkanen declined it, wanting more money, decided he'll do a prove-it year to get the payday he was looking for, had an even worse season, and ultimately got less than what the Bulls were going to initially offer him, and of course was then later traded. A little different circumstances because Vucevic is closer to the end of his career while Markkanen was on his rookie deal, but the concept still applies. Now, where Vuce does actually have a fair amount of leverage is, well, based on the Bulls' current cap space, they don't really have a ton, and also the lack of available big men who are going to be free agents this upcoming offseason to potentially replace him with. There aren't going to be a lot of options. And of course, the fact that the Bulls invested a lot in Vuce for a trade package that they sent to Orlando for him, it puts the Bulls in a place where they almost are going to kind of be forced to keep Vucevic long-term because of the roster they've constructed to have a floor spacing big in their system, as well as a big who can play make in the paint. That's something you can't just easily replace, and also just the fact that the Bulls are already limited with their size as a whole as it is. And of course, because the Bulls own Vuce's bird rights, they can offer him a contract extension without having it impact their salary cap and be able to use his salary to operate over the cap. So Vuce has those aspects going for him when looking for a more lucrative long-term deal. Now, the way I look at this, looking at it from both sides in terms of what benefits Vuce as well as the Bulls, I really see this going one of two ways. Either no extension is reached and both the Bulls and Vucevic see how this upcoming season goes. They assess both where the Bulls are at as well as where Vuce fits into the system and what a contract extension would look like at that point in time when Vucevic is actually a free agent, or the Bulls negotiate a one-year contract extension which would align his contract with DeMar DeRozan's to see truly if this core of Lavine, DeRozan, and Vucevic can take this team, this Bulls team, to the next level, and if not, they can pivot in another direction once the contract of DeRozan and Vuce expires at the same time. Based on how Vucevic showed up this past season, but also taking past performance into account because it's still possible this season could have just been an outlier given it was a new role for him going from being the number 1 option to the number 3 option, but based on all of that, I think a one-year extension worth $18 million would be reasonable. I know some are going to say that's insanely high based on what we saw from Vuce this past offseason, but the fact of the matter is, he's still one of the best big men in the game, even on a down year. He's still an elite rebounder, a versatile offensive player who can score but also play make. Yes, he has to be a more consistent shooter. He has to shoot the ball better from deep. That killed the Bulls last season with him shooting 31% from 3. But if you look at the market in the NBA and relative to Vuce's production, $18 million for a one-year deal at his age is actually very reasonable. I would even say $20 million, again, if it's just a one-year contract, is doable. Now, between these scenarios, for where I see this going, if I had to guess, I think ultimately both sides aren't going to agree to an extension this offseason. That doesn't mean that I don't think Vuce will remain on the Bulls beyond next season, but I think it's more likely than not that the Bulls aren't going to be willing to offer him the type of money that Vuce is going to be looking for. He's going to bet on himself and try to have a bounce back season to increase his market value to get a longer, more lucrative deal. And at that point, it'll be on Vucevic to show up and earn his payday, whether that means remaining with the Bulls or getting a contract from another team. And depending on how Vucevic performs, depending on how impactful he is to the Bulls' success, I could see the Bulls looking to potentially offer him a longer-term deal or at least a one-year extension with a player option for the second year. I won't be surprised if the Bulls do in fact offer him some sort of extension this offseason, but I don't think Vuce is going to accept it because he'll be taking an offer when his value is at its low. Now, here's the other thing. If the Bulls sense that extending Vucevic is likely not going to be an option based on what Vuce is expecting to get, say both sides are extremely far apart in terms of what they think is fair after these initial discussions during training camp, and it's so far off that even if Vucevic did in fact have a bounce back year, that the Bulls still wouldn't be willing to offer him what he's looking for based on the initial asking price, then yes, the Bulls could look to trade him, because you don't want a player on an expiring deal that you don't have plans to extend, to just have their contract run out and let them walk to another team as a free agent for nothing. I think this scenario is pretty unlikely, as much as some Bulls fans would like for it to happen, because I don't think the Bulls and Vucevic will be that far off on a contractual agreement when talking about an extension. And the other thing is, I don't think Vucevic's trade value is going to be that high to where it would be worth moving on from him relative to what the Bulls had to give up to get him. I do think the Rudy Gobert trade rumors for Vucevic and the other pieces would have been intriguing, but with the Bulls and their lack of draft capital and trade assets, to make a deal for Vucevic that would actually be an upgrade from him would be hard to come by based on the season that Vuce just had. I think a longer term deal reached this offseason is pretty unlikely, and it's pretty risky given the uncertainty on whether, that was just an isolated down year for Vuce, or if in fact he's on the decline. And offering him, say, 2 or 3 year deal that would pay him well into his mid-30s is not going to fly unless it's on a very friendly deal where it was, say, 3 years, $45 million. That would be cheap value for a guy of Vucevic's caliber, and to still be able to keep their core and build on that continuity that has been expressed numerous times by the Bulls front office. This would also give the Bulls a little more cap flexibility for the future to build more talent around them, with Vuce still being on the team on that friendly contract with the league salary cap continuing to go up. So in short, does extending Vucevic this offseason make sense? In my opinion, probably not, and I say that for both parties really. Vucevic probably isn't going to get the contract he's looking for because of how he played last season, and for the Bulls, too uncertain right now to be giving Vuce a longer term deal. You already have him under contract this upcoming season. See how he does. If he has a bounce back year, you pay him. Vuce gets a bigger contract. Both sides are happy. Great. If he falls off even more, ends up being a liability for the Bulls, then you cut your losses. Either look to trade him for low value near the trade deadline, or you completely cut your losses and let him walk as a free agent. I do think Vuce will remain on the Bulls beyond next season, but I think it'll be in the form of a 1-year contract extension that will be reached next offseason to align with DeMar's contract, rather than reaching an extension this summer. You let me know in the comments what you guys think though. Do you think the Bulls and Vuce will agree to a contract extension before the season starts, or no? As always, be sure to subscribe if you're a Bulls fan, as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.